extensive habitat are marl lakes. These are very high alkaline lakes, which in general are very polluted in Ireland, but the lakes in the south of the Burren, Lough Gallon, which I'm sure a lot of you know, but there are many other wonderful lakes like Ballyeichther, and they've a very special flora, mainly of algae, but not green blobs, rather nicely structured plants called charophytes. And one of them that's very common in these lakes is a plant called Caracurta, one of my favorites. And it's of great interest because outside of Ireland, it's not very common. Ireland, I'd say, might have 80 to 90% of the records in Europe. So it's close to being an Irish endemic and very sensitive to water pollution. So one of its great habitats are the lakes in the south of the Burren. And as I've done a lot of work in charophytes, if a stranger came to me and said, show me an interesting plant in the Burren, I'm afraid it's Caracurta is the first plant they'd be shown. But anyway, lakes are perhaps a specialized interest. We'll go on to turloughs. Uh-oh, problems here. Sorry, I'm afraid I'm having, yeah, we're in business. Turloughs, of course, are well known as a Burren habitat, but perhaps what isn't as well known is that some of the plants which grow on the dried out beds of the turloughs are very unusual indeed. This is a species of a rather obscure genus called Calitrichae, but it only occurs in a few turloughs in the Burren, one up near Glenamaddy, and a scatter of sites recently discovered in Scotland. And after that, it's very much a plant of Central and Eastern Europe. So again, if you come to the Burren, one of the very unusual plants is this Calitrichae. Slightly more elegant one is mudwort, or Limicella aquatica. In Ireland, mostly found in the turloughs around Gort is where you by and large go to find it. It also occurs, I think, in the Gira in County Cork. But it's slightly more elegant perhaps than my Calitrichae, but again, very unusual distribution, very specialized plant who's able to live in areas dry in summer but flooded in winter. So that's certainly the two, the Calitrichae and the Limicella, together for me represent the flora of our turloughs, which perhaps underestimated, not necessarily what people coming to the Burren would come to look at. After that, where would we go? Orchids. Now, Brendan gave us a wonderful talk last night about the orchids of the Burren. However, he didn't tell us a lot about distribution. And one or two of the plants he mentioned are perhaps rare or maybe no longer there, such as the sword-leaved helleborine. It was known from one place for a number of years in rock forest, but I think it's gone from there now. But one plant, the small white orchid, it was known 100 years ago. It reputedly still occurs around Lisdoonvarna on the shales, but other than that, I know of no location for it, except one tiny population on the flat Burren east of Eagles Rock. And there it occurs, literally 3 spikes of it. It was first discovered there by Ian Rippey from Portadown, who told both Gordon Darcy and myself about it and gave us a grid reference, and out we went to look. And sure enough, took out the GPS and lined it up with Ian's grid reference, and immediately below our feet, 2 small spikes of the small white orchid, Pseudorchis albida. That was 10 years ago. last summer, the minute the restrictions were lifted in the first lockdown, the three of us, at least Gordon, myself, and then Mishi Skeffington, reassembled to see was it still there. After a lot of searching, we found 2 spikes. So it's a rather rare plant. It's on the Flora Protection Order, slightly more common in Northwest Ireland, Leitrim, Fermanagh, that area. But of the 3 sites I know in Galway, 2, one just outside Galway City and one near Tuam, have both been destroyed. So a very rare plant you're not likely to come across unless you've inside knowledge. I'm beginning to realize the plants I'm recommending to you are botanical, I won't quite say aristocracy. They're very interesting to botanists. I don't suppose they're going to do very well in terms of showiness. Maybe the next one can change that. Here I agree completely with Brendan Sawyers. The Autumn's Lady's Tresses. It's a wonderful plant. It's always a delight to find it. It's not wildly rare, but it's a terrible habit of being present one year and gone the next. The last time I found it was last August at Mulroog on the shores of Kinvara Bay, where suddenly there were hundreds of them on a bank just above the sea. And as you can see, it is worth seeing simply for looks alone. It's a very pretty plant, but a very hard one to find in the same place in any 2 years. But I think there are a few other records, I think on the Rhine in Ballyvaughan at one stage at least. So where to next? This is the yellow bird's nest, a plant called Monotropa hypopithys, a very rare plant, maybe 10 populations presently known in Ireland at most. A plant completely characteristic of old woodland. As you see, no chlorophyll. Both the flowers, the stems, the leaves are a whitish yellow color. And it only lives on dead leaves, humus, and of course is in symbiosis with the fungus. Very much a characteristic plant of old woodland. So it was of great interest when Paul Murphy in Carron told me he had found a population 3 years ago, and Sabina, myself and Paul went out to pay our respects, and sure enough, hidden away in the hazelwood along the side of Carron on the east side was quite a large population of Monotropa. So it would certainly suggest that some of the hazelwood, at least, is rather old. And indeed, the lichenologists tend to confirm this by saying there are certain species in the Burren which are, again, almost unique to the Burren and the west of Scotland. So it's an indicator that while some hazelwood is just scrub, some of the older hazelwoods are immensely interesting, really gorgeous places to go to, and well worth journeying through some of the more remote parts of the Burren, the deeper valleys and so on, to find them. And after that, complete botanical oddities. This is a type of broom rape or a banquet. Now, there are 2 or 3 species in Ireland, 4, I think, Alba, Rapum gnistiae, Hederae, and this one, Orobanche minor. Now, Orobanche minor is thought to be an introduced plant that came in with pasture seed sometime in the last 100, 150 years. But this particular Orobanche doesn't really key out as Orobanche minor at all. And it doesn't, because if you look at the flower, I think florid is the word for it. If you see here, the lower petal, you've got these huge bosses on it. It's almost like an orchid. And it keys out, if anything, as a thing called Orobanche minor subspecies maritima. But the trouble about subspecies maritima is that that's an endemic subspecies only found along the south coast of England. And here's something not unlike Maritima, growing on the shores of the Burren. I sent it to the Orabanche expert in the British Museum, Fred Rumsey, and he wrote back, as experts often do, and said I was absolutely right. It wasn't ordinary Orabanche minor, but he didn't think it quite made the grade of being Orabanche minor subspecies Maritima. So I'm reminded of a quote that Professor Webb once made in his Flora, that British botanists decline to identify this species with its British equivalent, but offer no other satisfactory explanation. So I think that's what this Orabanche is. After that, this is more just a personal favorite. It's Dodder, Cuscuta epitymon, well known from the sand dunes at Fenor, but there's also a population, which we discovered about 6 or 7 years ago, Auchenish, just opposite New Quay. There's a small sand dune system there, and in it is the Dodder. It's one of the few places I know where it occurs. So again, a reasonably rare plant in Ireland, and this special little population on Auchenish. And I suppose that's one of the things about the Burren. It's forever showing you these unusual populations, not the plants you come to the Burren to see, not the gentians or rock roses, but of great interest in their own right. And for some reason, maybe just more botanists go there, the Burren has an exceptionally long list of such plants. And here's another Burren plant, rarely credited to the region. This is the yellow-horned poppy, a plant of shingle and sand dunes. Now, it's well known and at most occasional along the east coast of Ireland, from, say, County Down down to Wexford. Barely known on the west coast. If you go to the Burren flora of, well, it's a long time ago now, 30, 40 years ago, Webb and Scannell, they have no records for it on the Burren, except one. In 1966, Professor Moore of UCD, my old supervisor, found a population at the Martello Tower in Auchenish. And thereafter, it disappeared until the big storms of 2014. And we were down at Auchenish, and there it was, it reappeared. So it's the only Burren population I know of at the moment. It may reappear on the Rhine or somewhere like that, but for now, it's the only Burren population of the yellow-horned poppy. And really outside Auchenish, Town Island in Galway Bay and the Aran Islands, there aren't any West Coast populations. So going on from there, another plant, or my last plant, in fact, and this is me just being provocative, being a marine or an aquatic ecologist. Botany doesn't stop at the high water mark. Zostra beds, eelgrass, are a very important part of the flora of the sea. They have huge importance in marine habitats, and they're bona fide flowering plants, related, not exactly the same as pondweeds, but related to them. The beds are thought to be under some threat, but if you find yourself in Linans having a pint, look out the back window, look slightly to the east rather than straight across, and unbeknownst to yourself, you're looking at a eelgrass bed, which we discovered actually only earlier this year in 2021. So that's my list of 10 unusual plants that I'm very fond of in the Burren. You can see my own interests are very heavily involved, thurlocks, lagoons, and such like. And I'll just say to you that when you're finished seeing the standard fare in the Burren, there are many other unusual plants well worth seeking out. So thank you for listening to me.
I'll give Cillian a clap on behalf of all of us, because I think he still probably can't hear me. But that was just fascinating. And like Cillian said, you know, there are the familiar species and the ones that people come to see, but it really is so interesting to see these other species, the kind of the rarities. So that really was great start to the evening, Cillian, and thank you so much. Like I mentioned, if people did have questions for Cillian, possibly putting them into the Q&A section would get a better response, because currently Cillian can't hear us. But with that, I'm going to move on to our second speaker of the evening. And we're delighted to have Pádraic Fogarty join us, who is an ecologist and environmental scientist. He's been chairman of the Irish Wildlife Trust and editor of Irish Wildlife magazine, and is currently the campaigns officer with the Irish Wildlife Trust. He's author of a very interesting book, which was published in 2017, called Whittled Away, Ireland's Vanishing Nature. He's also involved in a new series of podcasts, Shaping New Mountains, which explores the root causes of our climate and biodiversity emergency, some of the myths that have emerged around environmental protection, and ideas for bringing back nature to our lives and our landscapes, which I think makes great sense then why he has given us this very controversial title, Farming versus Rewilding. And we're all very interested to see where this is going to go. So Pádraic, I'll hand over to you, and let's see what side we come down on the end of it all. Thanks, Pádraic.
Thanks very much, Anya, and thanks very much, Brendan, for the invitation to speak to you today. It's always a pleasure to be involved in any way with your organization, and I only wish I could be in the Burren myself to enjoy it. So as Anya said, I'm going to talk to you today. Hang on, go back up. Started at the end. That's not a good place to start. Here we go. Now, okay, so seeing and hearing, Anya, yeah?
Yeah, perfect, Pádraic, all good.
Okay, so I chose this title, Farming versus Rewilding for Biodiversity. And what I'm going to talk to you really about tonight, I mean, I know you guys know so much about farming and biodiversity, but I think the concept of rewilding is less known. So yes, and it is a controversial idea, it is a controversial term, and what I hope to do this evening maybe is just talk a little bit about what it is and what it isn't, and maybe explain some of the terminology and some of the ideas behind it. And you can see this lovely drawing that I commissioned by an artist called Jacek Maciak to go with my podcast series called Shaping New Mountains, which was kind of trying to imagine what the Irish countryside could look like, or maybe would look like under a different set of circumstances. And I think this helps us to understand an awful lot. So the term rewilding, it goes back quite a bit, actually. It goes back to the 1990s, and it comes from America. And America, of course, has a very different environmental history to Ireland and Europe in general. And but this idea about rewilding was really about what was defined as 3 C's. So it was about having core areas of conservation, that would just be for nature, and of course wilderness, which itself is a contentious idea, is very much an American idea, and but is embedded in American law as well as the imagination. So it's about having these core areas of wilderness, having corridors that linked these wilderness areas together, and about carnivores. So that was the 3 C's. And of course, carnivores were particularly relevant in America because the carnivores had been wiped out from the lower 48 states in America over 100 years, and wolves and bears and cougars and all of the big carnivores had been wiped out. So that's where those ideas came from. And then in about 2013, George Monbiot wrote a book called Feral. And I think that was the point at which rewilding was really popularized, about this idea that the landscapes that we're looking at are artificial, and they only look like that because we have made them look like that. And of course, we become so used to looking at them like that we think it's completely normal. And that wouldn't be the case if we were to manage them differently. So rewilding, I think, has entered the mainstream in terms of ideas as part of the solution to our biodiversity crisis. Of course, the word itself excites a lot of people, and that can be excited in a good way and excited in a bad way. And I suppose a lot of people will latch on to the idea that it's the wrong word, or the word is too provocative, or it doesn't mean anything. To me, the fact that the word is exciting and provocative is a good thing. I think many of us would agree that conservation, nature conservation, needs a bit of a shake-up. It's not going the direction we want it to be going. So maybe it's necessary to provoke people to think about things in a different way. And so for that reason, I think it's good. The fact that the word doesn't have a agreed definition, I don't think also is a particular problem. High nature value farming doesn't have a particularly scientific definition. Forestry doesn't have a particularly scientific definition. Regenerative farming, a lot of these terms that we use are not particularly well nailed down. They can describe new ideas or evolving ideas. And to me, that isn't a particularly big problem. So what is rewilding, or what is it not? And I mean, certainly I think we can agree that rewilding is not, it's not farming. Does that make it anti-farming? I don't think so. And I'll talk more about that later. But certainly we can agree that it's not farming. But of course, in Ireland, we have lots of land uses today that are not farming. So not farming shouldn't be controversial. We have land uses for forestry, we have land uses for peat extraction that are not farming, and that itself is not controversial. Of course, the controversial bit is that you may be talking about land that isn't commercially exploited. That can be very commercial, that can be very controversial. But then we have to engage with that. Why is that a controversial idea? And that, I think, delves deep into our psyches and our conscious and our subconscious histories, and there are reasons why we need to go there. There's reasons why we need to look at why we feel that that is a problem. One of the criticisms I hear a lot about rewilding is that it's about doing nothing. It's about just walking away from places and just letting nature take its course. And in a landscape like Ireland, of course, that isn't really an option that would result in a good outcome for a lot of biodiversity. So we have invasive species that would take over. We have drained peatlands, for instance. So rewilding isn't about just doing nothing. Rewilding is about restoring ecological processes, and I'll talk about those a little bit more later as well, but getting to a point where they need less and less intervention over time, so that ultimately you're aiming for a place where you're doing nothing and nature is self-sustaining. Isn't that the kind of the same as ecological restoration, which has been in the conservation conversation for many decades? And that is true. There is an awful lot of overlap between what we would have called ecological restoration and rewilding. Species reintroductions, for instance, is not a controversial conservation tool. We've been doing it in Ireland for many years. It's been widely practiced across the world. So a lot of the elements are not controversial. What is different between rewilding and ecological restoration is about the end point. It's interesting to note that rewilding is, after all, a verb. It's not a noun. It's not defining what we think the landscape should look like. It's not defining what species we think should live in certain proportions. So in many regards, it's not so focused on individual species or individual habitats. It's much more relaxed about the outcomes. And in many ways, that itself shouldn't be controversial either. One of the things we've learned in classrooms in ecology is that nature is very dynamic. Habitats change, they move. Species change in population, they go up and down and they move across landscapes. And so that itself shouldn't be controversial either. So rewilding encapsulates an awful lot of that, but of course it encapsulates an awful lot more as well. Now, I think an important point, if we're making a case for rewilding, is to recognize where we're at the moment in terms of the state of the environment. And I know many of you who are tuned in this evening don't need to be convinced about any of this, but nevertheless, I think it's important just to remind ourselves, because this is the background to every debate we are having about nature and land use and farming and pretty much every aspect of how we live our lives. And that, is, of course, is the climate and the biodiversity emergency. And these are just two graphics that I got from a really excellent website called The World in Data. I'd highly recommend you rooting around in it. It's very well presented. The graphic on the left you see there is the Living Planet Index. This is formulated by the World Wildlife Fund and the Zoological Society of London. And it has been measuring the populations of vertebrate life on our planet since 1970. So this is they've taken the populations of mammals and birds and fish and amphibians that are known, of course, an awful lot not known, but those populations that are known. And since 1970, those populations have collapsed by nearly 70% by the last count. So sometimes it's reported that it means that 75% of the species have disappeared. No, this is where species were once abundant and they're not abundant anymore. So whether we're talking about fish in the rivers or elephants or whales or whatever, that the populations of those species are about a third of what they were in 1970. And of course, 1970 was no Garden of Eden. So really it's signaling the enormous collapse of life on Earth. And the graphic on the right shows you a representation of the state of mammal life on Earth, and how 4% of mammal life on Earth now is wild mammals. It's everything from mice to giraffes to bears to kangaroos. And 96% of the biomass of mammals is now humans and our livestock, mostly cattle and pigs, as you can see from the graphic there, and about a third of biomass is humans ourselves. So humans basically have sequestered the space, the living space on our planet. And of course, we've reached into every corner of the planet, from the Arctic to the deep sea. And how we farm and how we consume is deeply related to the biodiversity crisis. And of course, we have this twin crisis through the collapse of the climate system as well. And you'll see on the right-hand side there is also from the World in Data, and that shows the average temperature anomaly. So it's basically the global change in temperature since approximately pre-industrial age. So 1850 is the origin year there. And you can see that the change in temperature since that time has been a little bit over 1 degree. And in 2015, world governments signed the Paris Climate Agreement, which said that we would keep our global temperature increase to within 2 degrees, well within 2 degrees, and ideally 1.5 degrees. And there was an interesting editorial in today's Irish Times, and it talked about the climate dialogue that was in Dublin last week. And it says that current delivery on emissions reductions, so basically business as usual, and on weaning off fossil fuels while scaling up renewable energy, will translate into a 3.7% increase this century. What is it about a planet close to the abyss that people do not get? That wasn't a quote from somebody, that was the Irish Times editorial themselves. So basically, business as usual is going to cook the entire planet. The disruptions we're seeing in the climate today is based on less than what we have set out to achieve under the Paris Agreement. So basically, we're saying, okay, we want more of this climate disruption that we already have, but we're going to limit it at a certain point. But even those commitments we know are completely off course. we're on track for nearly 4 degrees by the end of the century, and a lot of those calculations don't take into account climate tipping points. For instance, the melting of the Arctic, the melting of the permafrost, the loss of the Amazon rainforest. So I hope this audience tonight doesn't need convincing that we are in serious trouble in terms of the changes that are ahead of us in the coming decades. And one of the things about the climate, the Paris Agreement, is that even if we stopped burning fossil fuels in the morning, that wouldn't be enough to meet the targets. And this is a quotation from Scientific American. It's a few years old, but basically it's saying that meeting the 1.5 degree temperature target almost certainly relies on negative emissions. In other words, taking carbon out of the atmosphere. And even with aggressive emissions reductions efforts starting now. So we need some way of taking carbon out of the air. Now, those of you who have the patience to follow Elon Musk on Twitter will notice that a couple of weeks ago, he said he was going to give $1 million or something to anybody who could invent a machine that could take carbon out of the atmosphere. And of course, he was inundated with replies from people posting, you've guessed it, pictures of trees, pictures of bogs, pictures of the ocean, because we know that nature has evolved over the eons to remove carbon from the atmosphere. So we don't need a magic machine that hasn't been invented yet. We just need to restore nature. And nature can do an awful lot of the carbon removal for us. But that requires an awful lot of rewilding, I can tell you. So I suppose it's that context that I think rewilding is important, because I think if you don't really get your head around the danger we're in at the moment from an ecological point of view, rewilding may not make much sense, or it may seem like a kind of a vanity thing for, you know, people like me who just want wolves back in the countryside. But no. Rewilding is an absolutely essential part of our approach to the climate and the biodiversity emergency because of its capacity to remove carbon. But also, we need to rebuild natural ecosystems. Now, I put a question mark on the end of that. I remember when I started, I came late to studying ecology. I didn't do it as my primary degree. And I remember at the time, people in University College Cork, where I was doing my course, talked about the semi-natural habitats that we have in Ireland. And this never really went particularly questioned. And like, it was like, why are our habitats only semi-natural? Well, that's because we don't have natural ecosystems in Ireland. This is not a new idea. You know, people have recognized this for a long time. Basically, natural ecosystems in Ireland have collapsed. And many of them have collapsed many centuries ago, even. You know, if you're looking at our beautiful oak forest, that has ceased to exist as a functioning ecosystem for a very long time. Other ecosystems, I think, survived longer, but certainly looking at the Irish countryside today, we have no intact ecosystems at all, anywhere, on land or at sea. And if we want to benefit from the benefits that natural ecosystems bring, not only for removing carbon from the atmosphere, but for providing us with clean water and recreation and mental and physical health and healthy soil and biodiversity, we have to be talking about rebuilding our natural ecosystems. Now, we know that in many cases that is possible, at least theoretically, that is possible. That we can restore our bogs, we can restore our forests, if we wanted to. Will they look exactly like they were, you know, when they were original? That's an interesting question, because a lot of the time we don't know what a natural ecosystem in Ireland looks like. So this again brings rewilding to the fore, because we're not too hung up about recreating something that may or may not have existed 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. What we're doing is trying to repair natural processes and see what happens. And let's be a little bit relaxed about that. Now, this is I suppose it's demonstrating, without taking up all the time talking about why natural ecosystems in Ireland have collapsed. I thought these two graphics illustrated quite well. The one on the left was drawn by John Cross, who worked for the National Parks and Wildlife Service. And I think this paper is possibly, oh, there you go, 1997. So quite a bit old, but it was a kind of a thought experiment based on the soil and the climate. What would the natural vegetation in Ireland be? And I haven't provided the key to it, but basically everything you see there in green and blue and pink is woodland. Some type of woodland. It's oak woodland, it's birch woodland, it's alder woodland and wet areas and so on. The brown areas are bog, mostly upland, blanket bogs, which would be mostly treeless or generally treeless, if not completely treeless. So you can see that Ireland in a natural state would be mostly trees, it would be mostly forest, and that potential is still there today. But of course, I mean, if we look at the graph, the image on the right-hand side, which also comes from the National Parks and Wildlife Service, it shows a very, very different picture. And you'll probably read the caption at the bottom there. It says, the map is showing the distribution ALEW is ancient and long established woodland. And it says the areas are slightly exaggerated for visual purposes. In other words, it made the dots bigger so we could see them. And that is just how practically completely we have destroyed so much of the natural ecosystem type in Ireland. I mean, we know, of course, that our bogs are not doing much better. And the native woodlands we have, they're small, they're, you know, fragmented, they're missing species, they have invasive species, they're not functioning really as a natural ecosystem. They're under enormous pressure. But we do have an opportunity to restore that ecosystem and that vegetation. And rewilding can do it for us. Again, this is a photograph I took in I think it's possibly Cork. I think it's kind of Macroom area that I took this photograph a couple of years ago. And you can see a hillside that probably was grazed by cattle going back centuries, probably grazed by sheep, you know, if it was an average hillside up until recently. But the animals have been taken off. I have no idea what the actual story behind this hill is, but we can surmise. And we can see that the native woodland is coming back all by itself. No government programs, no native woodland scheme, no subsidy system. Nature is just doing all the heavy lifting for us. Now, many people will look at that hill and they will think land abandonment, and that it will bring negative connotations. They will think that is, you know, there was a farm family there that's no longer there anymore. Rural decline, you know, just this general trajectory that is happening to the countryside, that it is people are being squeezed out. But there is another way of looking at it. And if I told you it was a native woodland creation project, well, then you'd say, oh, well, that makes perfect sense because there's a native woodland scheme and where the Department of Agriculture is promoting this and there's very high premiums for it. Does that change the way we can look at the landscape? Can we look at the landscape and give room for nature in a way that doesn't bring negative connotations? Are there other economic opportunities from a landscape like this? Maybe ecosystem services, maybe tourism. Maybe it's just a nice place for local people to enjoy. Do we have to put a monetary value on landscape and on nature and on these things? So I think rewilding forces us to ask a lot of these questions. And I think it's very important that we engage with those questions, even if it's challenging. As I say, because of the challenges that we face. And is rural Ireland destined for decline? Are we going to just be always hearing that rural Ireland is on its knees? Or can landscapes with wild nature in them be more vibrant? Would a landscape like this attract people? Would there be people who say, I want to live in a landscape like that because it has wild nature in it and it has a sense of connection to the natural world? These are the questions I think that we're asking, and so there are opportunities, of course. Now, of course, rewilding is not all about vegetation. It's not all about restoring the bogs and our woodlands. It's about the species that have lived in them in the past. And I think this is where we tend to get very excited about rewilding for good reasons or bad reasons. But I mean, if we remember that graph I showed you about showing how 94% of the Earth's mammal biomass is now humans and livestock, what would that figure be for Ireland? The biggest animal we have in Ireland is the red deer, which is, you know, in very low numbers. After that, we have probably a lot of sika deer, which are non-native species. The biggest carnivore we have in Ireland is the badger. But we know that Ireland wasn't always like that, that we had bears and wolves and lynx and wild boar and so on. And we also know from an ecological point of view that these are absolutely essential components. They are as much a part of the forest as the trees or the fungi or the insects. So can we expect to have a kind of a rewilding light where we go, okay, well, maybe we can tolerate the trees, but, you know, wolves and bears are just too far for, you know, we just can't go there. So I don't think we can. I think we have to recognize that the forest and a natural ecosystem really requires these species to be present. Not only because they regulate the prey. So, for instance, deer. You know, we already have a very big issue with deer in Ireland in terms of if you want to establish a woodland, and it's unfortunate. I don't like considering our deer species as pests. They're not pests. They're important parts of our heritage. But we know that the numbers are going up and they're not being managed, and overgrazing is a problem. And so Ireland was full of these giants. We know that the wild boar, for instance, is an essential ecological engineer in the forest, creating disturbance. The photograph that Cillian shows you of the really rare bird's nest orchid, I mean, I wonder is a lot of the reason why a lot of the rare plants in the forest are rare is because of the lack of disturbance in the forest. Certainly a lack of regeneration. Boars create diversity and disturbance and are really important. The fish that you're looking at on the right hand side, and I took this off the internet, so I hope I got the actual species right, but the sturgeon is an absolutely enormous fish. It's over 2 meters long when it's allowed to grow to full length, and swam right up our rivers into the Shannon and the Suir and the Barrow and so on, and hasn't been seen since the 1960s, I think is the last confirmed. So Ireland was home to these absolute giants. And you see the golden eagle down there in the right-hand corner. The golden eagle was reintroduced to Ireland in the 1990s, and it's great to have it back. It's not, you know, it is an example of a reintroduction project. It's not a successful reintroduction project because the eagles have not expanded out of Donegal. They're under a lot of pressure due to the poor state of the landscape. But also the issue is that, like, if you want something like a large predator to play a role in the ecosystem, it has to be at a certain abundance. So it's not sufficient for us to just have species for the sake of having them and say, okay, well, they're not extinct, so that's fine, as long as they're not endangered. These species play a role, and we need to try to understand what that role is and allow them to reach densities in the landscape that allow them to play that role. Now, all of those species you're looking at, there are introduction programs and reintroduction programs going on across Europe. The wolf, of course, has made its way back to practically every European country except Ireland and the UK because of the pesky sea that's in the way. Bears are being reintroduced in France. There are over 2,500 wolves in Spain. There are lynx being reintroduced in Germany. There's quite advanced plans to reintroduce lynx into the UK. And all of these things, of course, we've got over 100 species that we know are extinct from Ireland, from plants to beetles and mosses, and we need them all back. I noticed last week the UK government announced that it was setting up a reintroductions task force. And I think that would be a wonderful idea for Ireland. I think we really need to get serious about rebuilding ecosystems and bringing these species back. Now, this is a landscape that you're all familiar with, and this, of course, is not rewilding. This is the beautiful, farmed landscape of the Burren that has been farmed for many thousands of years. And when I talk to people who are not from Ireland, the Burren is where I recommend they visit if they're of a natural history or nature enthusiast, because to me the Burren is the best preserved landscape we have in Ireland. And that's, in no small thanks to the work of Burren Bio and what you've been doing there. Farming is part of our heritage. It's not just part of our landscape, it's part of who we are as a people. There was dairy farming in County Mayo, up at the Cage of Fields. What are we going back 3,000-4,000 years? So, dairying, for all the controversy that it finds itself in today, has been going on for a very, very long time in Ireland. So I think we have to recognize that. We have to recognize the environmental impacts of modern agriculture. But of course, what you have demonstrated in the Burren is that farming doesn't have to be negative to the environment, and indeed it can be positive for the environment. And we see that in the Burren. So I don't think there are many people who argue against that. I think when you do hear arguments about the encroachment of scrub, for instance, hazel scrub in the Burren, it can sometimes come down to almost an accounting exercise. I hear some people say, well, these beautiful calcareous grasslands, they have X number of species, and, the forest doesn't have the same number of species. And I think that's probably not a very helpful argument, to be honest. I think we can look at them both as perfectly valuable. And certainly what has been going on in the Burren has shown its worth in terms of how farming and nature and heritage and livelihoods can live alongside each other. I think one of the problems that the Burren has come across is that, even though it's been around and proven its worth for such a long time, it's not seen as part of the solution to modern agriculture, to how we produce food. And that's a shame, because I think the Burren can teach us an awful lot about how we can adapt to the future without putting farmers out of business, while holding on to our heritage, and that's such an important thing. Now, this map on the right-hand side dates from, I can't remember the year, but you'll all be familiar with this. And this is, I think the Burren probably invented the idea of high nature value farming. And this map, you'll be familiar with. You'll see the Burren there in County Clare, and you'll see, all these areas of what were described as potential, the predicted distribution of high nature value farmland in Ireland. And the paper said that HNV, or high nature value farmland, is typically characterized by low density farming associated with high biodiversity and species of conservation concern. It didn't say that those areas were actually high biodiversity, but they were high biodiversity potential. Now, the bit of this map that people tend to not look at is the blue areas. So you'll see that there's a line that goes from Dundalk down to maybe about Clonakilty in West Cork, and south and east of that line, with the exception maybe of the Wicklow uplands, is not high nature value. So what this map is intrinsically saying is that these areas are low nature value farming. And I think there's a problem with this map, in that it has kind of embedded a bias in the way we look at our country, in that, okay, if you're in the west of Ireland, that's where nature goes, that's where we can have schemes like the Burren, and we can preserve our heritage. But the real business of farming is going on in the blue areas. That's where the money is being made, and that's where the innovations are, and that's where the real stuff of farming is going on. And I think that's a problem. And when you look at this is a map from the Environmental Protection Agency that was published late last year, and it shows the average nitrate concentration in our river systems. And of course, nitrate, you know, is one of the chief pollutants in our rivers. And you can see that the general pattern on that graph is very similar to our HNV. In other words, the level of nitrates in the west of Ireland and Donegal and Clare and West Kerry is not very high. But the level of nitrates in the east and the south is very, very high. And so almost that graph of the high nature value farming is reflected in the ecological and environmental degradation of the half of our country that goes from Dundalk to Clonakilty. And what I worry about the map on the right is that somehow is seen as now acceptable. And I think that is a problem. And I'll show you why I think it's a problem now. This is, I did a little bit of research in the run-up to this talk, just to look at some of the species that we see today as being synonymous with high nature value farming. And here's the curlew, which we know is in enormous trouble pretty much everywhere in Ireland. And this colourful map that you see is from the Breeding Atlas of Birds from 1988 to 1991. Now, 1988, I was 14 and I was going to the Gaeltacht in West Cork. So not a tremendous long time ago. And you can see already by the late 1980s, that division between the north and the west and the south and the east is already forming, but it hadn't completely formed, because you can see there's still breeding curlews in the south and the east in the late 1980s. The page on the right comes from a slightly earlier date. This is from 1960, this particular book. And in 1960, it said that the curlew breeds in every county and was common and widespread. Now again, 1960, you know, if you know, is a lifetime. It's not a particularly long time ago, and so it shows how the landscape has changed pretty much since that time in 1960. Here's another map of the distribution of the freshwater pearl mussel, and this shows that division, that northeast southwest division, isn't there. We see a lot of our freshwater pearl mussel populations in the south and east. And what has happened in the last 20 years, I mean, you know that many of the special areas of conservation in the south and east, the River Nore, the Suir, the Slaney, the Blackwater in Cork, are designated for freshwater pearl mussels. We have a legal commitment to restore favourable conservation status of the freshwater pearl mussels in these rivers. And yet, what's been done about it? The only meaningful action that has been taken by the government has been to try and delist the freshwater pearl mussel from particularly the River Blackwater. And luckily for us, activists went to court and challenged that decision, and the decision was overturned. So the protection for the pearl mussel remains. The legal requirements to restore freshwater pearl mussels in these rivers remains, despite the pollution problems, and it's such an enormous challenge. And here's my last example, and you know, I'm sure you could think of other examples. This is the distribution of the great yellow bumblebee. And you can see the records of the great yellow bumblebee come from all over Ireland. And on the pollinators.ie website, it says that the great yellow bumblebee was never common, but was found across the island of Ireland prior to 1960. And it's now only found on the west coast. So you can see really what has happened is that this migration of high nature value farming, it has happened because the south and west have been degraded. And what I worry about is that from a farming point of view, we create this sacrificial zone in the south and west of Ireland to allow for greater intensity agriculture. And so really what I think is we need farming in the south and east that is going to be high nature value farming. We need a Burren program for the River Blackwater and the River Nore so that we can get our freshwater pearl mussels back, and of course our salmon and all the other natural wonders that should be in the south and east. So I think that is maybe it's just an important point that I think we need to make about high nature value farming and where it should be in the landscape. Now, how do we get to that point? This is another one of the nice drawings I got Jacek to do for me, and this is trying to imagine what our landscape would look like, you know, in a farming landscape, where we have cattle and dairy, and where we have orchards and you know, fields of grains, and not just animals, but or not just animal agriculture, and also that we have landscapes that are full of insects and full of curlews and corncrakes, and the rivers are full of salmon and freshwater pearl mussels and dragonflies. And I think this is possible, and I think we have to, if we're going to reach for it, we have to have something in our mind's eye about what we're trying to achieve. And I think, of course, farming is very much part of the solution. I'm sure many of you have been following the debate between An Taisce, well, it's not the court case between An Taisce and the Glanbia cheese plant. And it has certainly ignited the argument over the environmental impact of farming in this country. And I think that's a very, very important debate. I can appreciate why it has upset a lot of farmers. I can appreciate why farmers are feeling threatened and uncertain, and feeling that their livelihoods are under pressure and under threat. But I also think it's very important that we have a debate about the very real and very finite limits to what we can expect from the land. And we know that we are way beyond the limits of what the land can produce. And the symptoms of going beyond those limits are evident in the water, in the air, in the landscape, in the plants and animals that aren't there anymore. And so the debate is very important. I do worry, of course, that the debate isn't where it should be. You know, it's not a debate about, you know, whether farmers are willing or not to do what needs to be done. It's not a debate about whether farmers like to have nature on their land. It's much more, in my view, a debate about whether the government really wants to meet our environmental commitments, or whether it really wants to continue driving agricultural expansion and export markets, because those two policies are incompatible with one another. So let's say, for instance, we finally come to the conclusion that we can't continue driving export markets and increasing production, and indeed that we have to reduce production, and that we have to get back within nature's limits. How are we going to do that? And, you know, I'm acutely aware that there are debates in the media and online about veganism and moving to a plant-based diet. There's also growing technology that I think is not getting enough attention on synthetic meat and synthetic dairy. I think, whether we like it or not, these technologies are growing and expanding. And anybody who remembers when the iPod was new and exciting, we can see how technologies can absolutely change very, very quickly. And I think farmers need to be certainly mindful of these changes that are happening and that are way beyond the remit of Irish government policy. And so where does farming fit in a future Ireland? There are some people who are arguing that we don't need farming at all, that we don't need any animal agriculture, that we can just get rid of all the animals, give all the land back to nature, and just make all our food in factories. Is that a country I want to live in? Is that going to preserve our heritage and our connection with the land and the place that livestock has in our culture and our heritage? No, of course not. So I don't think that is something that many of us want to see. But at the same time, we do have to have a meaningful debate about how this is going to happen. And one of I mean, I have many criticisms of Irish agriculture, but I also have a lot of sympathy for farmers on the ground who have basically been told, who have responded to the policy signals over the last decades, and who are now looking at a climate bill that is going to demand a 51% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions over the next 8.5 years, not a long time. And the strategy to me seems to be that, well, you know, we'll just get out of it somehow. We'll just make a compelling case that farming is more important than other sectors of the economy, and that somehow we'll get a free pass. And of course, even if that does happen, what does that mean for our water and for our wildlife in places in the southeast? So we radically need a new way of looking at farming in our environment. And I think, of course, as I said, the Burren has shown how that can be done. We also, you know, when we have a growing movement of what's called regenerative farming, which is more focused on regenerating the soil and using animals for recycling nutrients. We have long-standing organic techniques, and organic has the advantage over the other systems in that it is a certified system, and you know, you can put it on a label and people know what they're getting. Regenerative and high nature value farming don't have those certification systems. And of course, people would be willing to pay more for these products because people are already paying more for organic, and the market for organic food is growing. But of course, nobody has really laid that out to farmers. Nobody has said, this is what we want you to do, and this is how we're going to help you to get there. Organic farming in Ireland is one of the lowest levels in the European Union. It's about 2%. And we saw that there was a call for organic, the organic scheme opened up recently, and the response was disappointing. And that could maybe be explained that organic has not been promoted as a way forward for producing food. And that has to change, because all of the agencies of the state, whether it's Teagasc or Bord Bia, or the civil servants in the Department of Agriculture, put all their energy into increasing output and exporting it. And that's just simply not compatible. So we need a new vision. I think we know what we need to do. I think we know how to get there, but we do have to let go of the system that we know it at the moment. So where does that leave rewilding? And I suppose maybe this answers, I don't know, maybe it answers the question that I asked at the beginning. And my opinion is that we absolutely need both. And that in itself shouldn't be controversial. We know there are landscapes or places in Ireland that are not suitable for farm animals. Blanket bogs, ancient woodlands, river systems, for instance. We need to be rewilding these systems because of the enormous added value that can bring to biodiversity and carbon and water. And even within a farm, there are, you know, farmers know that there are parts of their farm that are not suitable for farm animals, and of course they've been penalized for that. So, you know, this is why I mean, a lot of this is not about farmers versus environmentalists. It's about conflicting policies at a very high level. And my view is that if there are farmers who want to farm and are willing to farm, they should be supported to farm. But we know we have many places where farmers are really only doing it for the subsidies, or really it makes no economic sense, or it's causing too much ecological damage. So that we need to choose the rewilding option over the farming option. And how much we can have both in our cities, in our towns, in our farms, on our hills, that really comes down to us as activists, as communities, as citizens. Those decisions will ultimately lie in our hands, and those decisions are being made right now. So my final thought to you is that we really need to be helping to steer those decisions in the right direction. So thank you again for listening, and I'd be happy to take any questions you might have.
Thanks a million, Pádraic. God, it'll take a while to digest. There's a lot there. There are questions coming through. I think a lot of them are probably beyond the scope of this evening. But I don't know, Brendan, were there any of the questions there that came through that you thought were...
Yeah, there's a bunch of questions. First of all, could I thank Pádraic for a really interesting and as ever provocative presentation. I think, like with Burren and Bloom, it's great to celebrate our biodiversity. And I think this is World Biodiversity Day, as far as I know, so it's very timely. But it's also good to be aware of the kind of the context in which our nature exists, or struggles to exist in some cases. And I do really like the fact that we're talking about big ideas, because we need big ideas around the current scenario of climate and biodiversity emergency. So whether you agree with Pádraic or not, I think it's a welcome discussion to have. And I think your conclusion, Pádraic, is a very conciliatory one. I think seeing the important role of farming in terms of food production and landscape, but also that of potentially nature, and giving nature a stronger role, possibly, or more space in future. So I thank you all for that, and lots of ideas in there tonight, and I really would recommend people listen to Pádraic's podcast, Shaping New Mountains. During the pandemic, I had it on as a podcast during my evening walks, and it was really, again, like tonight, very thought-provoking and very inspiring. Just a couple of questions then, Pádraic, if you don't mind. Just one for myself, first of all, a double-barreled question. One, rewilding in the context of climate change and this, increased frequency of forest fires, is that potentially an issue? And number two, how to reconcile the rewilding concept with the notion of or the fact of private land ownership in Ireland and the farm economy. How do you make a living from rewilding as a farmer with a piece of land if you're not interested in hosting visitors or whatever? Are you talking about being rewarded for ecosystem services?
Yeah, the fire one is obviously very relevant, and comes up every year, and people will have seen the devastating fire that happened in Killarney National Park. And I suppose this comes back to the point I was making at the beginning about doing nothing. So many of our uplands are so far gone, as in they're so badly damaged, that what has happened is you get mats of moorgrass growing. Moorgrass is the only thing that grows, and when it dies, it creates this mat, and basically it doesn't change. And there's a place in Wales where farm animals were taken off the hillside, I think 20 years ago, and basically nothing has happened. It is just this mat of moorgrass, and that's obviously not good for biodiversity either. So I think what the other thing we learned from Killarney National Park is that the forest doesn't burn. The native Irish forest is not flammable. Wet bogs are probably very fire resistant, even if they might be flammable. They're certainly wet and don't, at the moment the peat is so dry that the risk is that the peat itself will catch fire in one of these bogs, and when the peat itself catches fire, they're very difficult to go out. So what do we do about that? So again, it's not about doing nothing in that situation is not desirable. I did hear, and I think it might correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was the Blackstairs EIP was using native trees as a fire break, which I thought was very innovative and very interesting, because up to now we've heard, well, in order to control the fire, we need to get rid of all the vegetation and create basically very minimal vegetation zones. But actually, if we create these bands of native woodlands, they can act as fire breaks. So I think what the fire in Killarney told us is that what we really need is to reestablish native woodlands in a lot of these areas in order to minimize the threat of fire. Now, your other point about making a living, and I think if it was to be one of my big criticisms of rewilding as I follow it in Britain, is that the solution to farmers' income is that, oh, well, sure, don't worry about raising animals, you can just make money from tourism. And I think that can basically dismiss the culture of farming and the fact that people want to farm. and may be perfectly able to farm and don't want to just turn their land holdings into a B&B. So I think there's a couple of solutions to that. And if I might say as well, is that to me, I'm not interested in having large areas of wild land in Ireland or wild ecosystems, because I can visit them at the weekend. I want these areas near where I live, and I think that's, I want for people to feel the contact with not wild nature and why it's important, and that very much goes to the heart of our relationship with nature, and for people to recognize that having a healthy natural environment is vital to our communities. From a financial point of view, I think we have to pay farmers for this. We already recognize that we pay farmers for planting trees, but we penalize them for having trees that planted themselves. So this goes back to the absolute bonkers state of our land use policies. They're totally contradictory. They're totally at odds with one another. And in fact, it's one thing that farming organizations and environmental groups wholeheartedly agree on, that these eligibility rules have to go. So, paying farmers, at least what they're getting at the moment for restoring natural ecosystems, removing invasive species, for instance, I think is part of the economy of it. And for those farmers who say, no, I really want to farm, it's in my family and it's what I want to do, I say that's fine. That shouldn't be a problem. But you have to be in a high nature value farming program. If you want government support from the taxpayer and the public, after all, you have to get into one of these schemes. Now, of course, that hasn't been an option for farmers, of course, as you know. So we really need, much wider scale adoption and promotion of high nature value and results-based schemes.
Thank you, Pádraic. A question from Aoife Hughes. Aoife wants to know, what kind of rewilding or conservation actions would be the most impactful, do you think, in the south or east of Ireland? To your point about this imbalance that's suggested by the charts that you showed. So what kind of rewilding or conservation actions in the context of fairly intensively farmed landscape would you suggest or recommend?
I think one of the big problems we have in those areas is water, as I spoke about, and the freshwater pearl mussel. The freshwater pearl mussel is kind of the defining challenge, because as you know, the pearl mussel is very finicky about the kind of water it wants. And it's not just the quality of the water, it's the hydrology. So in terms of rewilding, we need to remove artificial barriers on rivers, and we need to restore river floodplains. We've invested huge amounts of money in digging our rivers up and straightening them and removing all the vegetation. And I think that there are schemes already to acknowledge that we need pretty wide buffer zones along our river systems, particularly the bigger ones. And I think rewilding our rivers is something that could be done without seriously impacting on farmland. Again, of course, a lot of these debates come down to, if you're intensively farming, you're pretty down to the wire. You've probably invested a lot, you've probably borrowed, you really have to meet your production targets. So anything that is going to diminish your returns is going to be you could imagine it's going to be problematic for you. But we have to, if as a society we're asking farmers to take that hit, we have to put our money where our mouth is.
Okay, thank you. Now we're running slightly over, but I think it's worth carrying on for those who want to carry on for a few more minutes. Tia Friedel has a very interesting comment. I think it's this notion of timescales and timeframes. So Tia says that some farmers adapt their land to fit criteria for subsidies. Over years, these continue to change as new incentives are pushed. Long-term visions keep getting cut short by economic incentives based on changing markets in Ireland and the EU and changing policies as well, I suppose. So how can rewilding become a viable long-term vision and deliver a competitive advantage against these contradictory outcomes from pursuing subsidies?
Yeah, and that's such an important point. I mean, people, it was, slightly just when I was coming into the ecology area, I think it was the round of CAP before now had what was called set aside. Set aside was basically, a rewilding measure that, look, you don't have to farm every square inch of your land and you can keep some space for nature. And then they decided they didn't want that anymore. So farmers who had, allowed nature to develop were then incentivized to destroy it. And so, they've had the miscanthus thing, where farmers were encouraged to plant biomass for the boilers in Bordemone, and that turned out to be a fiasco as well. So like I said, I totally recognize that farmers are perfectly willing and capable to respond to the policy asks, but if those asks are going to change every couple of years, that's incredibly frustrating. How do we get around that? I mean, we need a much more long-term vision for our landscape. I think one way of achieving that is through land use planning, and this is something that has been promoted by Eamon Ryan in the Green Party as a way of bringing together the contradictory or sometimes conflicting land use outcomes that people want from any particular piece of land. I think that would be an enormously valuable exercise in terms of joining the dots between all the various challenges, and maybe would give farmers some reassurance. But of course, as you know, the Common Agricultural Policy is being resolved imminently. Is it next week, possibly? If that doesn't align with the Paris Agreement and our biodiversity targets, where will we be in 7 years' time when we're coming back? We'll be either in a catastrophically worse place, or we'll be on the road to recovery. And I hope it's the latter.
It's definitely a big opportunity, because it'll define the trajectory over the next 7 to 10 years. One more question for me, and then maybe Anya can have a couple or wrap up as the case might be. Just one for myself, Pádraic. We had James Rebanks on last year from I think during the Winterage Festival, who's fantastic. He's a farmer who's passionate about wildlife. Really, I'm sure you know him, and he was kind of very vexated by a visit to Knepp Estate, and very impressed, obviously, but also very kind of made him think quite a lot. And I think how we reckon, and Knepp, of course, is the kind of the heartland of the rewilding story in the UK. It's the largest estate which has been rewilded in part, at least. And I think his way of reconciling it as a farmer with a long heritage on the land was rewilding almost at a farm level. So the notion of continuing to farm, but really setting some areas aside for nature, not in the term of set aside as in not farm, but really consciously plan and allow nature to come back in those areas. When we talk about rewilding, or in your vision of it, it seems to be a landscape scale. What's your opinion on kind of farm level rewilding?
Yeah, I listened to your talk with James last year, and he's a fascinating person. And it's interesting about Knepp, because from an ecologist point of view, Knepp isn't rewilding. It's because it's missing the carnivores. It's it is farming. They sell organic beef and pork from the pigs. So is it pure rewilding? But then the point maybe I'm trying to get across with this talk is, like, who cares? We're not. It should be seen as a spectrum. And there will be different solutions for everybody, because it's not just about the land, it's about the person who lives on the land and what they're comfortable with. So I live in the suburbs in Dublin. I've rewilded half of my gardens. I have a front garden and a back garden. I've rewilded half of both of them. I get very funny looks from my neighbours, but I don't care. And the result has been astounding. So it's whatever is within anybody's capacity to do so. I would love to see something like Knepp in Ireland, to just see how it can adapt to our circumstances. But criticizing Knepp for not being pure rewilding completely misses the point as well, doesn't it? I mean, they have transformed their farm into something that is absolutely amazing. I mean, I haven't visited it, but it looks absolutely stunning, and the results are there. What it does have in common, of course, is that they've been very relaxed about the outcome. They haven't decided that we want nightingales or purple emperor butterflies, but that's what they got, and that's been a fantastic revelation.
But I think, before I just hand back to Ollie, just to say thanks again, and I think, like, one of the take-home messages for me, at least, is I think if we try and interpret the term too much and try and pin it down too much, we can kind of get lost in it and get in a very controversial position, but if you viewed in a very broad sense as, you know, contributing to nature, whether it's in your own garden or on your farm or as a national policy, I think then it becomes something more, I suppose, meaningful for a lot of people and maybe less controversial. So I think I've really enjoyed the presentation tonight, Pádraic, and like we've tons of questions, we might forward them on to you just as for your own interest. But for the moment, thank you from me, and hand back to Anya maybe to finish up.
Thanks a million, Brendan. I feel like I'm the publican now at the end of the night who comes out flashing the lights when nobody's really ready to go. But I think we will have to wrap it up. But obviously a huge thank you to Pádraic and to Cillian earlier for just really interesting presentations, and to all of our speakers throughout Burn and Bloom. It's been a lovely couple of nights. And thank you to the Heritage Council and the EPA who have provided sponsorship, and also a massive thanks to my colleague Pranjali, who you will have met on all of the other nights, who has really been responsible for this event. Just to leave you with, I suppose, maybe if you've enjoyed the events, to consider supporting Burren Bio Trust. We have some great events coming up, both online and in person. We have a members talk on the 9th of June with the archaeologist Michelle Comer, who will be talking about her work at Caherconnell. So, you know, check us out on burnbio.com. And also it might be worth, if you are interested in these kind of topics, checking out the Burren Winterage Weekend, because I think these kind of conversations are very suited to the Winterage Weekend. But with that, I will leave you all, say thank you again, and hopefully see you online or in person in the Burren before too long. So thanks all. Good night.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Anya. Thanks, Cillian. Thanks, Pádraic.
Bye-bye.
Bye.